My name is Greg Mengarelli, Mayor of the City of Prescott, and your host for Prescott Today. We have a very informative show today. We're going to be looking at the city's water portfolio, and my guests today are noted water expert Gary Woodard and City Manager Michael Lamar. Thanks for being with us today.
Glad to be here.
Well, Michael, you know, early on in my mayoral career here at the city, I was asking a lot of questions about water and didn't have a great understanding. Safe to say I'm a novice.
I am too, Mayor. I'm from the East Coast where water isn't quite as controversial. That's what I say.
Well, Michael, give us a little background on how we got here with Gary Woodard.
So you and I started looking at our water consumption and usage, and we saw something that we thought was like a crazy anomaly. We looked back through our data, and lo and behold, in 2004, we had just under 20,000 water connections, and we were using about 8,100 acre-feet of water. And we start looking at current usage and connections, and we have over 24,000 connections, and we're using 6,700 to 6,800 acre-feet of water.
So we increased 4,000 hookups.
Yep.
Over 4,000, and yet our usage went down
1,300 acre-feet.
Right.
Not 13 acre-feet, not 130, 1,300. So first you're like, is this right?
Is this right? Yeah.
And then the next question is, how do you get to this point? How are you as a community, and we've done tremendous conservation as a community, our citizens are very water conscious, but it's still hard to believe that you could add that many people to a system and reduce your usage by that much. So that's how we brought Gary on board.
Right. First, is this real? And second, how did this happen?
Exactly.
Right? We need some answers. Yeah, so Gary, before we kind of jump in and get some more information from your study, I'd like to just share with our viewers some of what you've done in your career. Gary is a principal at Water Resources Consulting. Over the last 6 years, he's advised dozens of municipalities, private water companies, water districts, tribes, and regulatory agencies on various municipal water issues, with an emphasis on modeling and forecasting demand and evaluating conservation programs and measures. Prior to his consulting work, Gary spent over 30 years at the University of Arizona. His positions included Associate Director of the NSF-funded SARA Center and Deputy and Acting Director of the Water Resources Research Center. Additionally, he founded a Water Conservation Alliance and was President of University's Council on Water Resources. Gary has also worked closely with UNESCO water centers throughout the world, namely in the Middle East and North Africa. Well, that's a mouthful. You've done a lot with water.
Yeah, that's been pretty much my career for the last 37 years.
Yeah, and so you've worked with a lot of municipalities, Gary. One of them that I was really curious that you've mentioned was Tucson. And so let's just jump in and kind of give people some context of what you do. Give us a little rundown of what happened in Tucson and kind of your experience there.
Sure. So Tucson, like a lot of other Arizona cities, has long recognized that there are limits to their water supply, and they've been quite conscientious about it. They started serious conservation efforts back in the early 70s. So their metric for how are we doing was typically gallons per capita per day, and that has come down for a long time. What Tucson and a lot of other cities didn't notice was around 2000, plus or minus a couple of years, the total deliveries started dropping even as the cities began to grow. So total deliveries between 1998 2002 is typically the peak for all these cities, and a long, almost 20-year decline since then. So Tucson last year delivered about the same amount of water as in the early 1980s, and their population had grown by 70%.
It's crazy.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and if you look, Albuquerque did the same thing to a lesser degree. Phoenix, many of the cities around there, even Las Vegas, and now we're starting to see Los Angeles. They're all delivering less water even as their populations continue to grow. So,
what do you attribute that to primarily?
It's complicated. There's so many factors. Everything affects water demand, but the biggest factors are One, the new construction is a lot more water efficient than the existing housing stock and other customers. And two is that the existing housing stock has been gradually getting more and more water efficient over time. Now, some of that is due to the local conservation efforts, particularly like convincing people that, I like xeriscape, I want to plant drought-tolerant native species. But a lot of it had nothing to do with the local conservation efforts. It was that our appliances and fixtures, just by mandate, were getting more and more efficient. At first, federal standards drove it, and then the feds stopped pushing that, but there were these optional standards out there. And a few years ago, as they faced serious droughts, first California, then Texas, then Colorado made those voluntary federal standards mandatory in their states. So all of a sudden, if you're surrounded by them, if you're in Arizona or New Mexico or Nevada and you go to Home Depot or Lowe's to buy a water-using appliance, they meet the standards for these big neighboring states.
Gary, give an example of a fixture like that, like toilets.
Well, the fixtures, the big items there are your toilets and your shower heads.
Okay.
And for appliances, the big one is the clothes washer, and to a much lesser extent, the dishwasher. So as these things die of old age, or people remodel their kitchens, their bathrooms, they're making their houses more water efficient. And also gradually over time, people have been changing their landscapes. And the real story, elsewhere, people are getting rid of swimming pools at a surprising rate. But here and elsewhere, people are just not in love with turf like they used to be. Nobody wants to get up on a Saturday morning and push the lawnmower around. So
It's not something I miss from the East Coast.
Yeah.
So really in Arizona, your work has really revolved around modeling and forecasting for the most part?
Yeah. We used to rely on projections. What's happened in the past, push it out into the future. Or we would say, well, as population changes, so will water demand. And that started getting people in trouble because there's been this disconnect between population and water demand. So forecasts are good, but there's a lot of factors that are out of your control. What's climate change going to do to how much it rains here in the winter, or the snows in the winter, rains in the summer? What's the economy going to do? So there's things out of your control, and then there's things that are within your control that you might be thinking about changing. So in addition to forecasts, we build models that support scenario analysis, where you can go in and change the assumptions in the model and on the fly see how that will affect the demand.
Okay, very good. And just for our viewers, before we kind of get more into your data and kind of what you've done for the city, I want to make it really clear that there's been a lot of talk down in Phoenix about the drought contingency plan. And this has had headlines for several weeks, and I think a lot of people hear about DCP, Drought Contingency Plan. But tell us, Gary or Michael for that matter, are we in that drought contingency plan, or what's the story around that?
If you're in it, it's only peripherally and by mistake, because it's really focused at those who receive water from the Colorado River. Everything is tied to the levels within Lake Mead, and the desire to do some fairly painful things today to keep the levels up so that they're not facing very painful things in a few years. But since you have no allocation to that water, the intent is that those plans will not affect areas outside of
Mayor, I think that leads to something else that I think is important for the public to understand is, for all intents and purposes, we control our own water destiny. Is that a fair assessment, Gary?
Well,
ADWR gives us a lot of discretion. Is a better way to say that?
Right. Because you're in an active management area, DWR is intensely interested in what you're doing, but frankly, you're to a point now where their regulations, their targets are not really binding on you. You've exceeded what they wanted. The problem is you've got neighbors, you've got these other communities, and you're all sharing the aquifer. So you can do a commendable job keeping your own water house in order, but you do have to keep an eye out for the impacts of those.
It's a really great point that you raise. One of the things that I found frustrating a little bit in this community is that I feel like we're the A student in this region, and sometimes the focus is on the A student, when maybe the focus needs to be on the C and D student.
Yeah, Tucson used to feel that way.
Did they?
They were the big ones, and everybody, they served 70% of the metropolitan area's population, but you had all these private water companies around them that were just, they had other goals than to make sure that the grandchildren had good water supplies. But fortunately, those neighboring cities bought out the private water companies, formed their own water departments, and now they're all working together. And that has helped enormously. They've taken a regional approach.
But that's important when you're in an AMA.
Right. So to recap that, we are absolutely not a part of the drought contingency plan. That's a Colorado River water issue with Phoenix.
That's correct.
And then secondly, we are in an active management area. There's how many in the state, Gary?
Well, there were originally 4. They added one.
Okay.
They broke 1 and 2, so there's 5.
Okay. So we're in the Prescott active management area, and that's really what DWR looks at in terms of usage and all that. And I think, to Michael's point, we can control what we can control within that Prescott area, management area.
Right.
And I'm excited to kind of hear a little bit about your thoughts about how we're doing. I think we're an A student, but that's kind of why we brought you in, to really hear how are we doing. Because in our case, you have other municipalities, and then you have a lot of unregulated wells in the county where they're tapping into the aquifer and using septic systems and all that. Whereas in our case, we're actually recharging with our wastewater treatment as well as our lakes, which really helps maintain the aquifer, where many aren't, or aren't concerned with that, have different goals.
Right. Yeah, and you're in a good situation in that you control so many facets of the whole water cycle. The other cities, they're looking to get their renewable surface water from Salt River Project to the Central Arizona Project, so decisions are made that will affect how much they get, but you control your own renewable surface water. In Tucson, they do water, the county does wastewater. But then after they clean up the water, then most of it goes back to the city. So there's issues there.
Mm-hmm.
Here you do both. So that's great. You've got your own recharge facilities. Mm-hmm. So from that viewpoint, you're in a much better position to control your future.
Well, it's something we inherited, and we're grateful that we have this closed loop system, if you will, recharging back into the aquifer. So with your work here, Gary, when did you first become involved with Prescott, and when did you...
We talked early fall, I guess. Was that
Yeah, September, early October. I just got a call from the city manager, and I think the mayor pro tem, I think, and just said that there were some questions, there were some issues, and would I potentially be interested in looking at them more closely.
So this has been a work of 6 months, approximately, 5-6 months?
Or like 4
months,
4.
Okay. And what are some of the methods you use to assess, our water portfolio?
Yeah, so the general approach that I've taken over the years is, if you want to understand something thoroughly, particularly something that's complicated, just take it apart into as many small pieces as possible. So, I want to know the water use patterns for not just residential and non-residential. You need to separate out the single family from the apartments. You need to separate out the indoor use from the outdoor. You need to separately look at those on the sewer versus those on septic, and to the degree you can, get right down to the individual households, what's changing in households, the demographics, what's changing.
That's a big deal here, the demographic change too, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's one place where I saw some surprises, where things are different than the rest of the state.
Just smaller households.
Not only smaller, but continuing to get smaller.
Yeah.
For the rest of the state and the country, the household sizes haven't changed much since 1990. And here they've been marching down from 1990. The latest hard number we have is the 2010 census, but coming down substantially. Also getting older. The whole country's getting older, but you've gotten older at a higher rate because I think of the patterns of in-migration. Also getting a little wealthier. And those have big effects, particularly
What does
on indoor
wealth
use.
do in terms of water usage? Is it?
An odd thing is, most stuff, if I have more money, I might
consume more, right?
I consume more of everything.
Yeah.
But if you have more money, you might actually consume less water indoors because you're going to have a nicer, newer kitchen and bathrooms. So you're going to have those newer, more water efficient appliances and fixtures. Throughout the rest of the state, if you have more money, you're probably going to use more water outdoors. But swimming pools are not a thing here, and big grassy lawns aren't either. So,
Well, that's a lot of different variables you're looking at when you start talking, about the different demographics and even the socioeconomic. And I guess we had all this data available to you to look at.
most of it, and you don't expect the city to have it all. Like a really good data source is the county appraiser.
Okay.
So you can find out the value of homes, the age of homes. Age of home is a very important factor, and there's usually some other information. Is there a swimming pool or not? How is the home cooled? Are there evaporative coolers? So there's important information there. Some information you get from the state, but most of it, is from the city itself.
Sure. Well, I'd like to hear some of your highlights from conclusions. I know Michael started with this stat that since '04, we've reduced our usage by about 1,300 acre feet. But what are some other highlights or conclusions you saw in the data?
Well, the model isn't complete, so my conclusions are slightly tentative, but you've been dropping about 2% in total deliveries a year, even as it's you've been growing about 1% a year. And that 2% a year drop is pretty typical. Most of the cities in Pima and Maricopa County have had similar drops, but if you look at the details, they're all driven by different factors. And yours seems to be primarily less turf over time and just greater water efficiencies indoors. You've also, considering the age of your system, you've done a really good job on minimizing system leaks.
Good maintenance.
Yeah. Very good leak detection program, and when they find those leaks, they're jumping.
They're being
on
addressed.
them. Yeah.
Did you look specifically at recharge? We talked about this a little bit. We recharge from our wastewater treatment and from our lakes when we have a good year. So I think I'd noticed in 2017 that we had returned more water to the aquifer.
Yeah.
Than we'd use. Is that correct?
That's correct. So the amount you recharge from the wastewater treatment plants is pretty steady.
Sure.
Year to year. The surface water recharge jumps all over the place. Mm-hmm. There have been years. I think 2007 you had nothing. There were no diversions.
Just like precipitation related mostly? Is it related to rain?
Yeah. Whereas 2017, and this year's looking good.
Yeah, it is looking
yes,
good.
It is.
It's got more water than we want on the street right now. It's a little frozen, but...
Right, so you do get these big year-to-year fluctuations in that. On average, it's about half and half, roughly equal amounts on average.
Okay. And then ADWR plays a role here in regulation, and they give us an allocation annually. So we earlier noted that we had nearly 6,800 acre feet that we had used in the last year. What is our total allocation from ADWR?
Is it a little under 17,000?
Well, ADWR has three roles. One is they manage surface water. Although in this case, the real other party in the room with respect to surface water is SRP. So you have a DNO decision in order that limits how much water you can take from
Sure.
those reservoirs. Now it's a pretty high number, and I think you've only hit it once, and I think 2017. But then they also want to make sure that we don't have aquifers underlying big population centers that just get drawn down.
Sure.
And so they want you to get to safe yield.
Yes.
But they also set conservation targets for you, and you've, like most cities, you've exceeded
Yeah,
them.
we've blown those out of the water.
Right.
No
The
pun
target
intended.
that you had for 2025 was
Yeah.
being reached early across the state. So they have a number of roles, but none of them are binding on you right now. It's you're in good shape with DWR.
Right, we're using 6,800 acre feet our recent year, yet they allow us to use up to 17,000 acre feet. So in your estimation, we're well under the allocation from ADWR. You mentioned safe yield, and this is kind of a little, when I ask different people, sometimes I get different answers about safe yield, but I'd like to hear from you. What does safe yield mean, particularly when you're one entity within this AMA?
Right. So DWR has an opinion about what Prescott needs to do for the whole area to get within safe yield.
Yes.
The problem is you could do that, or you could exceed that, but the whole aquifer may continue to be in overdraft because of these factors beyond your control, the private wells and the other municipalities. So that's why you get different answers when you talk about it.
And the concept of safe yield is a hope and a recommendation, but it's not binding law, is it, at this point?
There are teeth. It's not, the state is never going to prevent you from providing the water that people need for
Life.
life. Yes. That's,
Well, and one more thing with DWR while we're talking about that state agency. When it comes to our lots, our preliminary plats, what we develop in the city, DWR doesn't have jurisdiction. They don't get into those weeds, if you will.
No.
Yeah, that's all our.
the assumptions about how much water you're going to make available for new growth this year and how much a single-family residence is going to need, those are numbers that you came up with that you decided to hold yourself to. And what's happened in many places, including here, is over time, those numbers get out of whack with reality. When they're first set, often you'll just let's look at the existing housing stock. Typical house is using this much water.
Yes.
Therefore, we'll assume that the next new home that's built will use a similar amount of water. Not going to, not even close, because they're going to have all the newest, most efficient fixtures.
Right.
But the other thing is, all of those existing homes continue to get more water efficient over time. So if you think you know what's going on with your paper water, but you don't routinely adjust, check your assumptions and adjust the numbers, your paper water is going to get out of whack with your wet water. Now, in this case, it's out of whack in a good way. You've got more wet water than
Yes.
It's a good problem to have.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah, having more wet water than paper water. You talk about single family residences, and I know here in the city, really before our time, the city had allocated 0.35
Per acre, per residential household.
0.35 acre foot per single family residence. Then recently, and I think maybe you were on staff when they changed it to 0.25?
They did, and I think it's 0.2 in a lot of respects too. But the reality of the circumstances, on average, households citywide are at 0.17. So for a long time, we were doubling the allocation of the actual reality in terms of usage, which I've heard the term headroom. This is more than headroom. This is head and shoulders and body room.
Yeah. Well, to Gary's point, right, is what we were allocating on paper was way more than what we're actually using wet water. And so we've had an adjustment, after this assessment. Maybe we'll take another look at that and see, are we really closer to 0.17 or thereabouts? You may want to give yourself a little bit of headroom, and I think that would make sense. how accurate is all of this that you're doing, Gary? In terms of the data, you feel pretty strong about the validity?
The data I have looks good. The databases are pretty clean. I don't have any serious doubts about the data. There are some data holes. I discovered that the county assessor, they in theory, they know whether a home has evaporative cooling or not. They don't.
Okay.
Is it the swamp cooler? Is that what people call those?
It's swamp coolers, evaporative coolers.
Yeah.
There is a field in their database where they could enter that. And when I said, so how many homes have swamp coolers? And 42. Probably not. Probably not. When they told me there was only 140, 150 swimming pools, that I believe. That they know. But and we eventually figured out why they don't know. But they don't know, and I'm not sure it's knowable, which is a bit of an issue because over time people replace swamp coolers with air conditioning, and that's just another way that homes get more water efficient. So there's some holes like that I'd still like to
Sure.
plug. But the data that we've got looks very solid.
Well, the nice thing about Gary's data is he's taking actual numbers and consumption and usage. The data he's looking at isn't speculative.
Right.
It is what it is, right? Is that fair to say for the most part?
Right. And the forecast, the model says, here are all the assumptions that this is based on. You have a question with these, change them. And immediately,
You'll see what the impact is.
So in Prescott, we have a lot of people that are very concerned about water. They really want to conserve, and they're very passionate. And I think that's probably true statewide, as people are really in tune to what's going on with water here in Arizona. But Gary, assuming that your assumptions are correct and what you're seeing with your forecast, what do you expect in terms of when might we see or face a shortage in water?
The model that I'm building goes out to 2030. So I can't say anything for sure after that. But the model is showing that at 2030, you still have a lot of water left.
Right, and I kind of go back to the aquifer is about a 3 million acre foot aquifer, and I know that wasn't a part of your study, but we know that from our experts here in the Prescott area, and we're using 6,800 acre feet annually. Michael, people worry about population growth, which we covered a little bit ago, is 1%, maybe 2%.
Yeah, you
when
can almost
really,
make the argument there's an inverse relationship, which is very interesting.
Right. So we are growing, but it's very modest at 1% to 2% annually. We're at 42,000 people right now, give or take. In terms of land mass, where do you see this going? People accuse us of being a phoenix at some point.
It's not practical here.
Right.
We have jurisdictions that abut us. There's topo issues. This community can only grow so much based on the land, right? And what you're seeing and what you're hearing is because we've been good stewards of the water, there is a lot of water for whatever development we have in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, even if we were to double at some point decades from now at this 1% to 2% rate, and you're at 90,000 people, say, and you're really built out, with new technology, at least you and I can speculate, we'll leave Gary out of it for a moment, we might be using 12,000, 13,000 acre feet of water.
That's right, Mayor. And the other part of that is when we're 90,000 residents, you and I will be pushing up daisies.
Right.
We're not going to be here for that, right?
Right.
This community's doubling in population is going to be your children and their children's children and my daughter.
Yeah.
It's not going to be us.
Yeah. Well, so kind of wrapping this up a little bit, Gary, what do you see municipalities do once they get this model? What do you typically see happen in terms of their water policy, or just practically speaking, what have you seen some municipalities, how do they use this?
In some cases, they use it to address specific problems. Like Tucson, they rely now on water that's imported from the Colorado River, recharged in a neighboring valley. That water comes to the city through an 8-foot tunnel through the mountains. And they've had this concern that something could happen, the tunnel could collapse, and they wouldn't have access to that water for months. So they were planning this $140 million backup pipeline. But because of the declines over the last 20 years, and because of the model telling them why and that it's going to continue for the foreseeable future, they canceled that, and they were able to go with a plan B that cost about $40 million to just have a bunch of wells within the city on a standby basis. The groundwater is coming up so rapidly there that wells that they shut off 15 years ago, if they were turned on today, they would yield far more water because the aquifer is being rewatered. More broadly, what you're seeing is some cities starting to rethink what this is all about. 100 years assured supply, that sounds like a tough goal to meet, but if you met it and exceeded it, and you've still got some water to spare, well, then the issue is, how should we use that to enhance the environment or to improve quality of life? So now in some cities, it's, we want to further reduce waste, we want to further increase efficiency, and then we want to plant more trees. Mm-hmm.
So really, it can really drive a lot of policy decisions. It could come in water savings. It could come in, financially, some savings that way. Michael, what do you anticipate that we might do here in the city based on these findings?
Well, Gary's talked to me offline a little bit about, alluding to the Tucson tunnel. Mm-hmm. When you have some of these expenses out that are tens and $20 and $30 million, and you cannot do them, those are real value to the taxpayer and the ratepayer, right? I think we're going to take real data and the model, mm-hmm. run different scenarios, and see how long we can get by with what we have.
Right.
And try to find ways to, improve things around the margins. One thing Gary suggested to me, and we have all the snow right now, is there a better way for us to capture some of this as runoff?
Right.
Because that's a recharge source that we're probably missing in terms of stormwater retention. Is that fair, Gary? That it's something we could look at a little closer?
Yeah, and you've seen more integration between the water folks and the stormwater folks. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to build detention basins, can you also use them for enhancing your supply somehow?
Mm-hmm.
And those types of solutions, Mayor, are a lot cheaper than large pipelines.
Sure.
And it also helps with water quality, because what you would do is you would normalize your release into the creeks, mm-hmm. which gives the ability for some sediment to get out of it and improve the runoff quality.
Sure.
So it has an environmental impact, plus it adds to the supply. Those are the kinds of policy decisions we're going to look at closer based on the fact that Gary's run these models for us.
Yeah, well, very informed decisions, which is going to be helpful. I appreciate your work, Gary. Michael, I don't see us changing, even though we have a lot of headroom, and this is a lot of good news coming from Gary's report. I really don't see us changing. We do the water smart, conservation efforts. We have incentive and rebate programs. You want to speak to that a little bit? Because we're not going to abandon those efforts.
No, we're not. And we may tweak them.
Right.
There are things that give you more bang for your buck,
mm-hmm.
in terms of what actually changes behavior. Mm-hmm. I see a lot of communities doing shower head handouts and toilet programs.
Sure.
And you see those things more impactful than some of the things we've had on the books historically. So our water resource department is looking at changing some of the rebate programs to more mirror what Gary's findings are showing.
Sure.
It just makes more sense.
Sure. Parting shots, Gary, anything else you'd like to share about your findings?
One problem that everybody has is aging infrastructure. And I think what drives me nuts the most is if people spend money planning for big increases in water demand that aren't going to materialize, instead of using those scarce dollars to fix what...
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah, I think
maintain what you have before you expand something you don't need.
Exactly. Michael, what would you like our viewers to know here?
Like I said very early on, the city of Prescott, and we deserve no credit for this, so congratulations to us for that. We've been great stewards of our water portfolio, and we are the beneficiaries of that. We need to message that better to this community, because we've allowed people on the outside to set the tone mm-hmm. and flavor of this discussion. And frankly, we need to take that back.
Yeah, we need to control the narrative, and it's driven from facts mm-hmm. and these findings that Gary has. By the way, the results of this study will be on the city website, prescott-az.gov. So if you'd like to go to our website, you can find the study that Gary has done. I want to thank you guys for being on the show today and for all the information.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor.
Well, lots of great news about our water portfolio, and we look forward to continuing to roll that out to you so you can get really good information from the city. That's all for our show today. Thanks to our guests, Gary Woodard and Michael Lamar. Join us next month on Prescott Today. Tune in to Channel 64 or go to prescottmediacenter.org. I'm Prescott Mayor Greg Mengarelli, and thanks for being with us.